Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello everyone, good morning and welcome to today's session of the NPTEL course Indian Fiction and English. This week we begin looking at the idea of caste as represented in Indian English fiction. There could also be certain instances where caste is entirely absent. So we are looking at these two ambivalent stances of the different ways in which caste is represented and also looking at those absences and gaps where caste gets represented either in a minimal fashion or in a certain way that would render its depiction extremely problematic. In this week's sessions, we will be looking at two novels primarily, one being Untouchable by Mulkraj Anand and the other one, The God of Small Things, the Booker-winning novel by Arundhati Roy. So the objective of today's lecture is to set the context, to set the stage for those discussions on those two novels, which are said to be predominantly about caste. There are a number of reviews, a number of critical works locating those two works within the moorings of Indian caste system. But at the same time, there are certain lapses, there are certain limitations and challenges within which those works are fraught as well. So this lecture needs to be seen in that context, trying to open up certain avenues for discussion in terms of the relationship of caste with Indian English fiction and vice versa. For this purpose, this lecture is loosely based on Tabish Khair's work Babu Fictions, Alienation in Contemporary Indian English Novels. It's a work published in 2005, where he also has an entire chapter titled Caste, the Hiranyagarbha Syndrome. He talks about the presence of caste and its relative absence and tries to place it in the socio-historical context of contemporary India. He also tries to theorize it, though minimally. A familiarity with Khair's chapter, Caste, the Hiranyagarbha Syndrome, would be highly useful as in when you try to follow this lecture. This work, Babu Fictions, it has a very interesting dedication at the beginning of this book. Khair has written, "This book is dedicated to family servants, village relatives and those friends of the first 24 years of my life who could not read Indian English fiction, but whom Indian English fiction often claims to have read." If you look at some of the novels that we have already engaged with, we have already understood that Indian English fiction claims to read and narrate the nation and its many inhabitants. It is a body of writing which claims to completely understand and to completely represent what India is about. And we have seen it in multiple ways in different novels. But here Khair is talking about a certain kind of an irony which is present here. And this irony gets all the more heightened. It's possible to accentuate the nature of that irony, especially when one begins to talk about certain problematic areas such as caste or gender. And quite rightfully, as and when he has situated the context of this work, Khair identifies three major areas of tension as far as the narrative world of Indian English fiction is concerned. He talks about caste, class and gender in that context. He goes on to argue that being problematic areas, being problematic concepts, there is an absence, there is an apathy and sometimes there is a certain kind of a redundance with which these themes are, these ideas are treated. And he goes on to examine in detail the treatment of caste, especially in Indian English fiction, and that's the objective of this entire chapter titled Caste, the Hiranyagarbha Syndrome. He makes this much talked about and mostly visible connection between caste and English language, to be specific, upper casteness and English language. And he talks about how, for reasons of inhabiting privileged circumstances, privileged habitats, the Indian English authors, they are also able to distance them away from certain realities such as caste, which is mostly relegated as an unmodern thing, which is mostly seen as a backward thing that the modern secular citizen would rather not associate with. Caste makes this statement somewhere in the beginning of this chapter itself. Here, if English education of a cosmopolitan proficiency is seen as a culturally empowering and economically incashable factor, notice how language is being seen as culturally empowering and economically incashable. The group of English speaking and writing Babus, the reference is obviously to the authors, the Indian English authors, can be almost solely located within the upper caste and classes, forming a sort of intellectual and cultural cream in secular fields. This obvious connection that Kher begins to draw between English language and the ones who inhabit those worlds empowered by English language, it is not a novel idea. Many sociologists have spoken about it. There are a lot of historical and sociological concurrence and evidence to this kind of an observation or an idea that Kher is projecting. But to be able to see this in the context of Indian English fiction, that is perhaps the originality that Kher brings in to this strand of argument. Here he is referring to the cosmopolitan habitats that are familiarized, are frequented by the Indian English authors, and he also equates this cosmopolitan proficiency with upper caste and upper classes. Herein lies the problem to begin with. Herein lies the ambivalence that Kher is perhaps trying to engage with. And herein also lies the superficial understanding of caste, which Kher at some level is trying to uncover, is forcing us to rather uncover. With a few introductory statements on the status of caste, and having explained how caste could be understood in the modern context and how jati is different from the modern understanding of caste, and having provided a certain sociological sense of how caste operates in modern India, Kher begins to talk about the overwhelming concentration of the Indian English gaze on the middle and upper classes. And he gives the example of a novel like Antapura, published in 1938, which we have also noticed was celebrated as a novel which presented a microcosmic vision, a microcosmic idea of the nation. And there we also found that the author Raja Rao, he claims to have a very authentic insider's kind of an information, an insider's kind of an outlook on the depiction of an Indian village, a typical Indian village, which is entirely fascinated, which is entirely in awe at the new emergent nationalist politics under the leadership of Gandhi. We find the character Murthy and a number of other characters who are being presented from the perspective of an upper caste narrator who is present within the novel, and the novel itself is authored by an upper caste author. And having stated these things, Kher goes on to make this argument and claim that even the other novels which are based in Indian villages, they have this tendency to look at and represent the rural middle class and upper caste, and that is seen as the presentation of the rural middle class and the upper caste within the context of an Indian village is then presented as being pan-Indian. So, the problem inherently lies not in talking about the upper caste presence, not in telling the stories of the middle class or upper caste individuals who are characters in the novels, but the problem begins when you begin to present these limited narratives as being pan-Indian. And there is also a tendency then to assume that perhaps there is a pan-Indian caste in village, a pan-Indian caste in the urban areas where it is minimalized, where it is presented in a minimal way to such an extent that it becomes impossible to see through the many complexities within which caste operates. Kerr also alerts us to certain different kinds of depictions which are also rare exceptions in the context of Indian English fiction. Kerr talks about the novel Untouchable by Anand, which we shall be looking at in detail this week. There is a lower caste character Baka, but the character of Baka is also described from an upper caste perspective. There is a problem inherent in that which we shall be looking at in detail shortly. And there is also Raja Rao's character Javni from his short story The Cow of the Barricades. There is a presence. If you ask someone whether the lower caste characters have been presented, yes, there is a presence. But in what ways are they presented? Therein lies the challenge and the limitation and the problematic. In Kerr's own words, it is not that the caste other is completely ignored, but that his or her presence in most cases has been subsumed, rewritten and marginalized. One would like to argue otherwise, presenting different case studies from different contexts of Indian fiction. But Kerr maintains through a series of discussions, which you would also figure out if you read through the essay, there are many examples that he gives from Indian English fiction written from the 1930s onwards to showcase that there is a way in which a pan-Indian caste gets talked about, but there are no actual references, there are no indicators of the way in which caste operates in a very complex and ambiguous manner. And this reference, this depiction is either of the middle class and the upper caste, which is seen as pan-Indian, or there is a way in which the lower caste character also gets incorporated into the narrative fold, but through a definitely an upper caste perspective. And there are certain instances where Kerr talks about, he refers to the presence of a lower caste character where the character is used mostly as a device to reinforce a shaken status quo. The example that he gives is from the novel The Cradle of the Clouds, published in 1951, where a character, a low caste Hindu, is used to represent tradition, to reinforce tradition, and he is along with two other characters, one a Brahmin and other a Christian. So Kerr is trying to ask perhaps whether the lower caste characters are used conveniently here, whether the presence of the lower caste characters are manipulated or maneuvered in such a way that it also serves the same end, especially in Cradle of the Clouds, as we can see the three characters, Brahmin, Christian and the low caste character, they are not essentially different because they together, the objective within the narrative for these three seemingly different characters are only to reinforce tradition, only to talk about, only to glorify the important aspects of tradition. And there's another interesting aspect that Kerr talks about, where he identifies that the impetus to emancipation almost always comes from the upper caste character. He gives the example of Murthy in Kantapura, which he also talks about in detail. If you recall the narrative structure of the novel Kantapura, you would also remember that Murthy becomes extremely important in that village Kantapura. He ceases to be just another villager. He becomes almost like a mini Gandhi. He becomes an extension of the political figure of Gandhi, and Murthy gets elevated to this status in spite of the regional, local situations within which he is placed. He becomes someone who is capable of leading the entire villages irrespective of the caste-class differences. There is a subsuming of all kinds of differences, class, caste and religion, which happens over there, which we also notice in the depiction of a villainous character, Bade Khan, the only Muslim character in Kantapura who is also presented as a villain. And there is a clear difference in the narration between us and them. The narrator, the female narrator, being someone who belongs obviously to the upper caste. So the us and them dichotomy, which is built in perhaps inadvertently, and this responsible protagonist, who also incidentally again belongs to an upper caste character, they all seem to tell us that there is a way in which a normalcy gets restored. There is a way in which a certain kind of normalcy is ascribed to the presence of an upper caste character as a protagonist, as the leader, as the main storyteller, as the one who gives perspective. While the presence of their caste names or the references to caste rituals become incidental, they never refer to anything as being even remotely casteist. That is something very interesting that perhaps we can continue to observe in most discussions about caste in the contemporary, especially when they are represented in different kinds of art forms. Drawing from these examples from contemporary Indian English fiction, Kher is trying to drive home the idea that there is a problematic lack of independent lower caste characters within the fold of Indian fiction. He tries to engage with the many reasons for this, and he ends up identifying certain factors of class positioning, cultural heritage, urbanization, and the geographical location of the Indian English authors, which surprisingly are rather similar. He reminds us that most Indian English writers are far removed from spheres of active caste-based prejudices, let alone caste conflicts, which contemporary India is also ridden with. And he refers to most contemporary Indian English authors as being based abroad or in cities like Delhi, Calcutta, Madras, Bombay, and Bangalore. And there's also ample evidence to show that Kher is not entirely wrong. It would be rather naive to say that it's a concerted effect, it's a concerted effort of all of these writers to deliberately ignore caste, to deliberately stay away from spheres of active caste-ridden areas. It just so happens that, again incidentally, it just so happens that almost all Indian English writers, they seem to be inhabiting a certain kind of class privilege. They seem to be inheriting certain cultural heritages, and they also seem to be part of a growing urban cosmopolitan set of authors who are entirely removed from the realities which are part of caste-based conflicts, class-based conflicts, or any region-based differences. And Kher in certain ways is also trying to reason out this lack of lower caste characters by trying to tell us that maybe this is the kind of reality, this is the kind of social circumstances, the social circles that these authors are used to, and this becomes a realistic kind of portrayal for them. And a kind of caste-based society where there are differences based on caste, where there are conflicts based on caste differences, those things become relegated to a past. It is a past that modern India would rather not associate with. The secular Indian citizen would rather distance himself or herself from. And in these limited attempts, in this challenging situation, Kher also identifies certain brave attempts. He calls them brave, but he also has certain reservations about them. He makes a reference to the younger writers who have moved away from what he calls a Rao-like knowledge of caste. He finds Rao's position in terms of his depiction of caste, his depiction of Kantapura as an ideal village society. He finds those depictions problematic, but nevertheless Kher is very careful and rather prompt to acknowledge that Rao was knowledgeable about the intricate hierarchies within which caste operated. And this, he says, this knowledge is not available to the younger writers for whatsoever reasons. Maybe it's not part of their immediate reality, or it is not there at all in the urban cosmopolitan circles within which they operate. And referring to these brave attempts, there are two works that Kher makes a particular mention of. Rohinton Mystery's novel A Fine Balance and Arundhati Roy's novel The God of Small Things. Both have used lower caste characters, In Arundhati Roy's novel, we have Veluta, who's almost as significant as a protagonist. And in A Fine Balance, which is a series of stories strung together and within the backdrop of the event of emergency, we have two important Dalit characters occupying the center stage almost throughout the novel. But this depiction of the lower caste characters, the use of lower caste characters in these brave attempts, Kher says, are not without lapses. He quotes an earlier work on mystery to argue that there is almost an anxiety on mystery's part. And he gives a specific example of the way in which Dina, the female character who also belongs to a Parsi family, he gives this example of how Dina's stories are narrated and how Ishwar's and Om Prakash stories are narrated. Ishwar and Om Prakash are the Dalit characters here. There is a classic kind of realism which we can see when Dina's past is portrayed. It's a very classic realist portrayal. But the moment we enter the stories of Ishwar and Om Prakash, either in the past or from the way they are narrating it from the present, we find the elements of the fantastic, the fairy tale, the newspaper reportage, and all these seemingly unreliable things coming in, because there's no other way in which the stories of Ishwar and Om Prakash could be narrated. The realist mode that he adopts while narrating the story of Dina cannot be used in the context of Ishwar and Om Prakash because their worlds are entirely different. You also need certain different genres and certain different kinds of elements coming in to complete the story, to make the story more palatable, more believable. Yeah. So, this is what Kher tries to point out when he is talking about the lapses in these presentations of lower caste characters. And there is also certain dangers in moving to the other end of the spectrum, where just like Anand's Untouchable, there is a tendency to present the lower caste characters as being godlike, as being the perfect image of godlike subalterns. We find a similar kind of a treatment, maybe not to the extent of to as we see in Untouchable. We find a similar kind of a treatment being employed in The God of Small Things too, where Veluta is presented as a different kind of a subaltern, as a different kind of a paravan. Yeah, that's kind of the word that the novel uses. We shall perhaps take a look at these things in detail when we talk about the novel The God of Small Things. While Kher is attentive to the many lapses in the depiction of the lower caste characters or in the approach of these younger writers in the context of caste, he also acknowledges that they are more open to the idea of certain kinds of socio-cultural change than perhaps the Rao Anand Narayan generation was. So, the younger post-Rushdie writers, they try to deliberately embrace this idea of change by depicting a different social setting altogether. But Kher says that there is still a problem inherent in that, because in most cases, again not all, in most cases this openness to the idea of change, this acknowledgement that the world order has entirely changed, the claim that it's more or less a casteless society and it is no longer possible to have a caste-ridden society, mostly works as an extension of, as a legitimation of their own cosmopolitan class positioning. Kher argues it out brilliantly in his chapter, which I again encourage you to read through closely, and he furthers his argument to show that the absence of the complexities of caste, either in the narrative structure or in the lived reality that these Indian English authors see around them, the social circles that they move around, this absence is not proof of the irrelevance of caste, should not be taken as proof of the irrelevance of caste, because caste continues to operate in visible and in invisible ways, perhaps outside this fold. Maybe there is a fold of Indian English writers or any such kind of privileged coterie where they can afford to be immune to certain social realities. This is this is applicable not just in the case of caste, it could be true in the case of gender, in the case of religion, in the case of many things that we talk about in a society. And we may also recall Spivak's observation that we have not yet seen an Indo-Anglian fiction writer of tribal origin. Yeah? Could this be an incidental fact too? Notwithstanding the fact that there are many writers emerging from the Northeast who also face different kinds of challenges in terms of being marginalized and being pitched against the post-Rushdie writers of the mainland. We will talk about it in one of the following weeks, where we focus on the writers from the Northeast. And this inability to engage with the historical and dialectical development of caste is something that concerns Kerr to the core, because he argues that if one is not attentive to the complexities in terms of history, in terms of dialectics, one will not be able to engage with caste in a proper way. To quote Kerr, by leaving unaddressed the complex historical and dialectical development of the structures of caste-based exploitation, one fails to provide a plan of action to tackle it in the present. Because whenever, in most cases, whenever caste gets talked about in the context of Indian English fiction, it is either incidental or to show that it is possible to surpass the limitations of caste, that caste has ceased to be important. It is an irrelevant concept in the modern context. But this kind of an invisibility, this kind of an irrelevance attributed to caste will be extremely delimiting in the long run, because as Kerr points out, if one does not acknowledge the basic structures from which caste-based exploitation emerges, it would not be possible to come up with a plan of action to engage with it, to respond with it, to even to attempt to solve it. And this could be seen, an extension of this could be seen in multiple ways in the arena of Indian English fiction. Kerr gives us a couple of more examples, one being the use of myth in the narratives of Indian English fiction. He draws from Meenakshi Mukherjee's observation that Indian English authors prefer mostly myths drawn from the Ramayana and not from the Mahabharata. Mukherjee also reasons this out in a very interesting way, because she argues that the Indian mind finds it easier to accept the ideal characters of the Ramayana rather than the ambiguous, complicated characters of the Mahabharata. And she also furthers this argument, which Kerr also uses to further his own claim and his own argument, that the Ramayana vis-a-vis the Mahabharata is seen as a wellspring of upper caste, largely Brahminical value system in India. And for the same reason, Kerr extends this argument to wonder whether the use of myth being limited to the Ramayana is also an indirect way in which Indian English fiction tries to limit itself to this largely upper caste value system. And in terms of gender and sexuality also, we find this difference being showcased in rather alarming ways. We have noted how unattentive, or perhaps how irresponsible, the field of Indian English fiction is towards the many depictions of gender, how stereotypical certain observations are, and how the post-Rushdie generation has almost managed to gloss over the area of women's writing in ways that we looked at briefly in one of the earlier sessions. Kerr refers to one of the best-selling novels of the post-Rushdie period, Upamanyu Chatterjee's English August. There is an instance of a violation of a tribal woman by a Babu. Babu is the protagonist, the lead protagonist, who is also an IAS officer who is posted in the rural hinterlands of northern India, and he feels rather trapped there because he is a modern, cosmopolitan, fun-loving young man who realizes that there's nothing that he shares in common with the rural India. And this violation, which emerges as only an incidental episode in the course of the novel English August. In fact, I also remember one of the reviews talking about this episode as as a way in which August, the protagonist, merely responds to a tribal woman. It's not even an important sequence that the novel or any of its discussions refer to. So here the violation of this tribal woman by the protagonist August is presented in terms of Babu's different sexual norms. Yeah, Babu is the term that Kher repeatedly, almost throughout this work, he uses to refer to the privileged status that the Indian English author or any other privileged citizen enjoys. So in English August, this violation is presented in terms of the privileged citizen, Babu's different sexual norms, and of the Babu's sexual starvation in a sexually frigid zone. Beyond that, it does not have any significance because a tribal woman's sexuality or the violation of it can be glossed over as an incidental episode. It need not be outrageous. It need not receive much of our attention. Yeah? Just like the Dalit man's death or the Dalit man's marginalization can be glossed over in, say, a narrative like The God of Small Things, where inevitably, irrespective of the radicalism that it presents, towards the end, it ends with the death of the Dalit man. So just like it becomes an incidental occurrence, here we find that the trampling upon of the sexuality of the tribal woman also occurs as an incidental episode. Kher wraps up this discussion by referring to the urban landscapes in Indian English fiction. We would perhaps have the time later on to look at how invariably most Indian English novels are located in these cosmopolitan cities of India. How there is a pan-Indianness to these cosmopolitan cities, and how it also becomes a certain kind of a norm to talk about the narratives of India. And he asked this, Kher asked this very pertinent question: what is the character of the Indian English town or city? We find that there is a certain uniform kind of a landscape that we can find in Indian English fiction, because most urban landscapes are organized less in terms of caste and more in terms of class. And it is much easier to gloss over caste and completely subsume and minimize the effect or the after effect of caste in an urban class-based society. And he also makes this important point to showcase that the urbanness in Indian English fiction, the depiction of the urban landscape in Indian English fiction, is also a trope, a ploy, deliberate or inadvertent, to totally override the effects of caste, because the kind of class which Indian English fiction talks about is a class system that is often, he clarifies, not always, superimposed on older lines of caste divisions. You just name it differently. So caste becomes merely an incidental occurrence over there, with class somehow occupying a more important position. And there is a way in which one can always equate class with various other factors like the economic aspect, the cultural heritage. It could be something that you acquire through education, through the kind of exposure that you get. There are multiple ways in which caste can be camouflaged. Caste can be made completely invisible when you use certain markers of class. And this is what perhaps Indian English fiction had been, perhaps inadvertently, doing. This is the kind of argument, this is the line of argument that Kher tries to pursue throughout this chapter. And in the context of this discussion, I encourage you to take a look at Untouchable and The God of Small Things in detail to see how there is a glossing over of caste even when the novels are really about caste. You would see that both these novels have adopted different pathways to talk about caste. In Untouchable, it's a very Gandhian way of looking at caste, and in The God of Small Things, we find a more refined lower caste protagonist, someone who is conscious of his rights. A politically aware Dalit emerges as the protagonist in the form of Veluta. it is of course a very radical way of presenting a caste what Arundhati Roy has adopted. But nevertheless, there are certain inescapable inroads within which we find the depiction of caste continues to be fraught in the context of Indian English fiction. As I wrap up this lecture, I also leave you with this repeated appeal to read the novels Untouchable and The God of Small Things, so that you would be able to make better sense of the discussions which are to follow in the following sessions this week. I thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing you in the next session.